Have you ever had to walk away from a dream or give up on something you had been hoping for? Maybe it was a career or a relationship, a sport or a hobby. It was something you had been training for and planning for and working for, and then you had to just walk away. Maybe it was circumstances like an injury or a change of life. Maybe it was someone's counsel that strongly encouraged you to step back and step away. What did you do? How did you feel? Felt like you lost so much. You had given your life to something. You had been training for something. You've been working for that only to walk away. If you're like me, you felt lost. You felt confused. You feel like a failure. Why was I giving so much and then walking away? But let me add to that. Sometimes the reason you've walked away was because of someone. Maybe you started a new relationship and it changed your priorities, and you willingly stepped away from something else that you really enjoyed and you really liked, but you gave that up for a relationship. Maybe because of someone and their challenge or their encouragement, you stepped away from something that you thought was important, but they were encouraging you to refocus and reprioritize. I know for me personally, I was at a significant juncture in my life as a young man, trying to figure out and think through where I was going to go to college and what I was going to do with my career. And so I was planning on working hard toward. I had a scholarship to go into the Air Force ROTC. I was hoping to get into the Naval Academy, and I was waiting for my appointment. And right at that point where I was preparing to make that decision, I felt God speak to me and call me into vocational ministry. And I had to choose whether to walk away from all of the plans and scholarships and everything I have been working for now for years to just pursue a prompt in my heart. Now, that's not the only time I've done that. Since I went into ministry, I've had many moments where I had a dream or a passion or a sense of calling that I needed to do something. And then I would be sharing that with Laura, and she'd tell me, Patrick, I don't know that this is the right timing. Maybe for you, how did you handle it when someone challenged you to walk away or step away from a dream or a hope or a calling? I know, again, if you're like me, you could struggle with resentment, almost blaming them, it's your fault that I'm not doing that. Or you could trust them because you know their character and that they're looking out for your best, and go even though it doesn't make sense and I can't see what you see, I'm going to trust that you know that you're seeing something different. Let me ask you a much harder question. It's the same course of thought, but it's a little different direction. Now, what if somebody asks you to do something that goes against what you think is best? I think I should do that. And they're telling you, no, don't do that. But it also goes against what you believe about their character. Somebody's asking you to take a step or to step away from something, but you misinterpret it, believing that they're doing it because they're greedy or they're selfish, or maybe because they want you to sacrifice for their best interest. I'll be honest with you, there's not a scenario that you've walked through, there's not a dilemma that you've faced that is anywhere near what this guy I want to share with you about, his story, compares to, right? Abraham was faced with a vastly greater, more severe situation than any of us will ever face and should ever face. Now, Abraham is a big deal. I got to give you the backstory here briefly, but Abraham, whose story we read about in the Bible, is the father of, and viewed as the father of, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All of them look at Abraham as kind of the founding father of their faith. So he's kind of a big deal. And so in this moment, we learn about the nature and the character of God, certainly as people of faith who hold to the Bible, that would be people of Judaism and Christianity, we discover a lot from the story of Abraham, especially when you look at him as kind of this founding father of what we believe. Well, let me give you kind of the backstory of his life. Abraham his name was Abram. He's a nomad who God speaks to and says, hey, you need to leave your father's land. This is why he becomes a nomad. And he begins to travel. And God says, I'm going to give you a promised land. Along the way, God confronts him and challenges him. His name means, so Abram means high father or exalted father. The problem was he had no kids. And he'd never had kids, meaning he was very old, over 80 years old. Don't be offended, those of you that are over 80 years old, but he was over 80 years old, very old to have kids. And God spoke to him and said, I'm going to give you a child. And through this child, I'm going to make you into a nation. And so he has Abram change his name to Abraham, which means father of nations. And then God gives him a promise that through your son, there's going to become nations. And through those nations, I'm going to bring blessing on the whole earth. And so we have this story where Abraham is holding on to this promise, and then God asks him to do something unimaginable. And so please, before you tune out of my sermon, before you just check out and walk out, because this sounds egregious, and how could Patrick even talk about this? That's kind of the point. How could it even be in the Bible? In fact, I have done my best to avoid preaching on this story. For me, I feel like it's really uncomfortable that it's even in the Bible, but maybe those are the moments when we need to lean in and go, why is it there? So there's this story where God speaks to Abraham and tells him to do something that sounds literally absurd. Let's read it. It's found in Genesis chapter 22. I'm going to start at the beginning. Sometime later, God tested Abraham, and he said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain. On the mountain I will show you. Early the next morning, Abraham got up, loaded his donkey, and ran away from God. Rejected God, cursed God. I don't believe in that kind of a God. Turned his back on what he understood to be the God he worshiped. No. He loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. God spoke to Abraham, and the author, Moses, gives us a little indicator. He kind of gives us a little clue that God is not looking for human sacrifice. God is testing him. And right there, it says, sometime later, God tested Abraham. Now, this isn't God tempting Abraham. The word testing means to refine, to clean up, to transform. And so God is wanting to refine Abraham. He's not tempting Abraham to do something evil. So you get this little indicator that there's something else going on here. But he asks Abraham to offer his son as a sacrifice. Now, again, you can see why I would do my best to avoid preaching this, because it just sounds heinous. In fact, what is even more shocking is that this story would not have sounded crazy where Abraham lived. In the ancient Near East, there were a lot of religions who believed that their gods were calling them for human sacrifice, for child sacrifice, if they wanted to win in battle, if they wanted their crops to grow. And so they would offer child sacrifice. Again, I know this is even hard to hear, but basically, if they wanted their desires fulfilled, they would have to appease the gods by giving what was most precious to them. And now Abraham is confronted with whether his God is like all the other gods of the ancient Near East. If his God is like the gods of the culture around him. Now, we know the moment we start reading this story, that God was looking to test or refine Abraham. And so we know that God is not looking for child sacrifice, but Abraham didn't know that. And so we're confronted with this challenge, this wrestle in Abraham's life where he is struggling with, is God, the one true good God, like all the other gods around me? Is our God like all the other gods of every other religion? Does our God manipulate? Does our God ask us for sacrifices in order to do what we want him to do? Is our God's character like the character of every other religion? And this is Abraham's struggle. And as he goes to offer this sacrifice, there is an understanding, as this story is being written, that others who would see Abraham, others who would read this story would learn from it. They would learn, the Jewish people would learn, is our God like the gods of all the other cultures around us? Is your God like all the other religions? Is your God someone that you can manipulate? If you give up the most precious things to you, will God do what you want him to do? In order for you to win the battle or to get the promotion or to get your way or to live out your desires, can you manipulate God by giving up the things you want most? Or is God's character such that he asks you to give up the things you want most? For Abraham, he was giving up his promised son as a sacrifice. So as we keep reading the story, we're going to lean in and we're going to learn more. Abraham brings him there. He said to his servants, stay here. I'm sorry, let me jump ahead. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering, placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Abraham, Father? Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and the wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the two of them went on together. I want to be very clear here. Abraham was not lying to his son. What we're confronted with is not just that Abraham chose to believe that God was different than the gods of the ancient Near East, but that even when God asked him to do something that seemed a lot like those horrible, evil, false gods, he was willing to trust God's character, that God is different even when he's told to do something that violates his understanding of God's nature. Follow me. And not just that God doesn't want child sacrifice, but that God would spare his son even if he asked him to sacrifice him. That's what Abraham is saying. He's telling his son, God will provide. He's saying, God, I will trust you even if you ask me to do something that goes against my understanding of you. Now, we've read the news. That's why this story seems so egregious, because we've read insane, horrific, evil stories of people who've actually done horrible things like this, which is why the story's there. Because whether it was way back then or today, this strikes too close to home. And the real point of the story is that God, his character, is good and true. Even when the culture around you is telling you that God's character is bad and horrible, he is good and you can trust him even when you think the character of God is not what you imagine it to be. So here is the point. Abraham is challenged and called to an altar of obedience. And the altar of obedience means trusting God even when it doesn't make sense. Let me repeat that. The altar of obedience is this place in your life where you look back on what you've believed about God and you're looking forward to what God is calling you to do, and you're challenged to take a step of obedience even when it doesn't make sense. What do you do? When the commands of God, when what you read in the Bible doesn't match what you believe about God. When what you read in the Bible doesn't match what the culture tells you to believe. When what you read about God doesn't match what feels good. What do you do? For Abraham, he built an altar of obedience, which means trusting God even when it doesn't make sense. Now we got to keep reading this story here because we got to lean into this. If you go down to verse 9 and 10, when they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and he took the knife to slay his son. Again, this is a horrific story, but I want you to catch something here. Abraham was fully trusting God. He trusted God's character even when the story didn't make sense. He trusted God's promises even when God asked him to do something that seemed to violate God's character. Abraham goes all the way, fully obedient. He goes to the point of binding his son and lifting up the knife. Now, we've got to keep reading because I don't want to pause here, right? Verse 11, verse 11 says, but the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide, or Yahweh Jireh. In the German translation of that, they would say Jehovah Jireh, as many of you have heard it. He called that spot, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. What is the point? What's going on here? What causes death? Why do we have beliefs about, in the world around us, a culture that seems to want to destroy, that seems to glamorize death and destruction and ruin? Not because of God, but because of evil. That we live in a broken world where things are not as they should be. Why were the religions of the ancient Near East encouraging child sacrifice to appease the gods or manipulate the gods? Because of a deep spiritual problem that existed then and is still corrupting our hearts today, giving us distorted desires that want things we should never want, and to pursue things that we should never pursue. We turn our back on God because of this spiritual force called sin that separates us from relationship with God. And when we turn our back on God and we do what we want, we hurt our relationship with God and others, and we're headed toward a forever far from God, an eternal ruin. But God, in this story, what God is doing is he's confronting Abraham with, would you trust me and my character? Even if I asked you to do something that seems absurd, would you trust me enough to know that I am good and I am true and I would never want your son's death? That's the point of the story. The point of the story is that it points to another story. Follow me. This is really important. What is this story about? This story is pointing to thousands of years ahead, when another son would come who would be a lot like Isaac. In fact, let me show you the parallels. There's only 2 times when you read the entire Bible that a child is referred to as my son, my only begotten son in another translation. The words used there, it's only referred to Isaac and Jesus. There's 2 sons, both promised. Isaac is promised to become the father of nations to Abraham. Jesus is the promised Messiah, the promised son. Both have a miraculous birth. There's no way that Abraham and Sarah should have had any children. It's a supernatural, miraculous conception, a miraculous birth, very much like Jesus. A miraculous conception, a miraculous birth. And then as you continue to move forward, Isaac is given the wood of the sacrifice to carry up the mountain. Jesus carries the cross as he walks up the mountain. Interestingly, Abraham and Isaac go up Mount Moriah, which eventually the city of Jerusalem is built right near there. So Moriah is a mountain just on the outside of Jerusalem where Abraham offers Isaac. Thousands of years later, Jesus would carry the cross up a hill outside of Jerusalem where he would be sacrificed. 2 fathers asked to offer their son as a sacrifice. And this is where the similarities end. Because what God spoke to Abraham was, stop. I do not want your son's death. In fact, what is so shocking is that God does not want your sacrifice. He would rather give you a sacrifice. He gave Abraham a ram to sacrifice in place of his son. God so wanted Isaac to live that he gave a sacrifice to spare his life. God so wants you to live that he offered his son as a sacrifice in your place. Why? Because we deserve to die. Not as an altar, not on an altar of worship or obedience, but because of our disobedience, because of our rejection of God, we were living a life devastated by sin, headed to a forever far from God in ruin. But God intervened in our story, became one of us, and God offered his son as a sacrifice for our sin. His life, the payment for the death we deserved. This is exposing the character of God, that God does not want death but life. And this is a story that was passed down generation after generation, that God doesn't want your death, he wants you to live. God doesn't want your death. He doesn't want your eternal death. God wants you to live and live forever. And so he offers you a way out. He offers you a sacrifice, but Jesus didn't stay dead. He supernaturally and miraculously rose from the dead to offer you new life and forever life, so that anyone who believes in Jesus receives forgiveness of sin, death penalty removed, and you're given new and forever life. Now, wait, can I challenge you and encourage you? Would you say yes to Jesus by faith right now? Would you make a commitment to Jesus? In fact, can I encourage you? If you're ready to say yes to Jesus by faith, would you make that decision? Would you make that commitment? And would you let us know? You could scan the QR code that's on the screen. And we want to encourage you as you scan that QR code to fill out the form so one of our pastors can follow up with you and encourage you as you begin this new journey in relationship with God. Now, as you begin this relationship with God, this journey, you're going to get to a point where God's going to test, refine your faith in him. And he's going to invite you to trust him. And here's what happens. Trust transforms your relationship with God. Trust transforms relationship. When Abraham chose to trust God, It redefined and transformed that relationship with God because God knew that he would obey him no matter what. God knew that in this place, Abraham understood the true character of God no matter what was going on around him, no matter what he was scared of, no matter what fears were stirring up in him, that he would trust God. And as a result, this strengthened and deepened his relationship with God. But let's take it even a step further. In verse 5, we get this moment. This is before they go up the mountain. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you." Abraham is making a statement to his servants. I am confident that we're going to go worship God and we're both going to come back together. See, Abraham knew that even though the request made no sense, that God would be true to his promises and that God was about life, not death. Here's what I can tell you. Obedience precedes understanding. When it comes to God, he's going to ask you to trust him, to put your faith in him, to obey him even when it doesn't make sense. And I assure you that you're going to have to act in obedience before you get the understanding of what God is asking you, why God is asking you for that. Abraham simply trusted that he was going to go worship God and both him and Isaac would return. There are times when your faith is going to clash with your culture. And you're gonna begin to really wrestle deeply with, do I trust the character of God? Do I trust what I read in his word, that this is true and good, even though it violates my conscience and it violates the culture around me? Do I trust God that he knows best? He wants what's best, and he calls me to what's best. I'm to be honest with you, even I was writing this sermon, I was thinking very much about the biblical ethic on sexuality, on gender, on loving your neighbor, on generosity and giving, sacrificially, on serving others when you want to be served, and thinking how much of what we read in the Bible kind of goes contrary to a self-focused, self-absorbed, indulge your every desire kind of thinking in the world around us. And then we have a God who says, trust me and obey me, even when you can't make sense of it. I know what's best for you. I want what's best for you. And if you'll obey me, sometimes you'll find out why that's best. If you jump over to James chapter 1, verse 2 through 4, you read this. That what does this testing of our faith do? What is this act of we have to obey before we understand? Here's what the brother of Jesus wrote in his letter to the church in Jerusalem. He said, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." He goes, here's what James is saying, and it's illustrated in the life of Abraham. God tests our faith to strengthen it. There are times when you're going to be challenged to be obedient. You're going to look back on where you've been. And up to this point, you've understood your faith, your belief, your trust in God, your worship of Jesus a certain way. But in order to look forward, God is testing you. You will go through seasons where your faith is being refined. It's being strengthened as it's being tested. Peter going into the waves, that was a testing of his faith in order to strengthen his faith. You will go through seasons when you're tested, where you're challenged, where your faith requires you to obey before it makes sense. Let me say this very clearly. It's easy to do what you're asked when you agree with it. Anybody can submit to a command that you want to obey. Everybody will follow orders that they want to follow. At some point, it's only obedience, it's only trust, it's only faith when it violates what you want. I hope you caught that. So there are times when God is going to test us and our willingness to obey by faith in order to strengthen us. Now let's jump back to get toward the end of this story. Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it's said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." Now, whether Jesus was crucified on Mount Moriah or not, a lot of scholars believe that he was, that on this place, the Lord would provide. That God would make a way. He not only provided a ram in place of the son, he provided a son in place of your sin and your certain death. And what I hope jumps out of this story is that when you obey, no matter what, you will never outgive or outtrust God. God will always match your step of devotion and obedience with a greater blessing. Your belief will be matched with an abundant blessing. You won't ever outgive God. Your faith will never meet a God who is cheap or reluctant, a God who is holding back from you. No, you have a God who is willing to lavish his best on you. A God who wants to bless you and give you life abundantly. You have a God who wants only what's best for you. But you have to trust him. Sometimes God's going to ask you to give when it makes no sense. Sometimes God's going to ask you to say no to something that you really want because he has something better for you. Sometimes God's asking you to trade the immediate for the eternal because God is at work for your best, your ultimate best, and the ultimate best. God will never be outgiven. You will never overtrust God. I mean, there'll never be a point in your life where you trusted God too much. Try it. Obey him. Now, a quick disclaimer. God will always be true to his word. Don't think that God is ever going to ask you to take a step of faith or call you to obey something that violates his revealed character in his word. What should be abundantly clear from this is that God was challenging Abraham. I am not like the gods of the world around you. I am not like the gods of lust and of death and of destruction and of ruin. I want life. So every time God is asking and challenging you to do something, it will be consistent with his word. It will be for what is ultimately good and best for you. And it will be for your life, your eternal life. Can I pray over you? Jesus, thank you that you love us that much. That you were willing to come from heaven to earth to give your life, to give us life. We don't earn it, we don't deserve it, but we believe it. And so, God, we trust you. And we're willing to obey you, even when it doesn't make any sense, no matter what. God, give us hearts that are surrendered to you, are willing to trust and obey you, even when it's difficult, even when it goes against what we think it should be, even when it goes directly against the world around us. Jesus, we want to live for you and obey you. No matter what. In Jesus' name, amen.